the San Francisco Experience podcast. Brought to you by Jim Herlihy. Independent commentary from a Silicon Valley, California perspective for a global audience, featuring newsmakers, thought leaders, and authors. Season 21, Episode 9, The Siberia Job, in conversation with John Kleinheinz. John joins us from his office in Fort Worth, Texas. Hello, John, and welcome to the show.
Hey, Jim. Thanks for having me.
By way of introduction, John is the CEO of Kleinheinz Capital Partners. In the early 1990s, he managed the Russia Value Fund, an emerging market strategy that focused on the voucher privatization program. A graduate of Stanford University, he serves as the chairman of the Board of Overseers at the Hoover Institution, the renowned think tank. John, it's been over 30 years since Russia privatized its economy. Why did you choose this moment in time to bring out The Siberia Job, and why fiction?
Jim, good question. So I was operating in Russia very early in my career, and it was a fascinating time for me. It was when Russia was going through upheaval after the end of the Cold War and trying to transform itself from a command economy into a market economy, and they developed this vast privatization program. And when I showed up, there were just so many interesting things going on and so many people showing up in Moscow, and I made such good friends. And I saw things that were so unique. After I got done with Russia, I kept thinking that was possibly the most interesting part of my career. And I just always wanted to tell the story and write a book. And then a couple of years ago, something sad and tragic happened. My partner in a big deal that we were working on in Russia was killed in a helicopter ski accident. Mm-hmm. And I just thought then if I wasn't going to write the book after that happened, it would never occur. So I've never written a book before. I contacted a good friend of mine in San Francisco who had run Scribner's, and I told him what I wanted to do. He introduced me to a literary agent in New York that is one of the oldest literary agents in the country. I think they represented Herman Melville and Moby Dick.
Oh, really?
They helped me interview and look for an author partner to help me with the story. So that was the origination.
Very impressive. John, you were in your early 30s when you set off for Moscow, and you played a critical role transforming the vast, centrally planned Soviet economy into the free enterprise system. Heady stuff. Did you have any Russian connections before taking on that assignment?
Well, first of all, Jim, I'm not sure I played a role. I was a bit player, and I was there when this was just going on. So I wouldn't characterize what I did as having a major impact. But no, I didn't have specific contacts there. I traveled to Russia in 92 and had some observations and thoughts about the economy then. And then I went back again in early 94. In 92, it was a horrific situation. The economy had ground to a complete halt, and the workers weren't being paid, and there were no goods on the shelves in the shops. There were no cars on the streets. Everybody sort of was walking around with their head hung low, and frankly, it was as sad a place as I'd ever seen. When I went there again in 94, it was a whole new place. Everybody had a deal. Everybody was pitching an idea, trying to get a job. The streets were full of cars. You could get any item you wanted if you had the hard cash to buy it. And it was a tremendously exciting period. I knew I wanted to look at the market, and so I did what I always do when I look at a new investment. I start calling people and tell them I'm working on something. And I didn't have contacts, but I made them very quickly. People that I knew and respected told me who I should meet and who I should work with and who the crooks were and who the good guys were. And I just showed up and started finding people to work with.
Mm-hmm. Before we jump into the Siberia plot, let's take a look at the history. On August 4th, 1992, President Boris Yeltsin signed a decree to create a voucher privatization system whereby every man, woman, and child in Russia would receive a privatization voucher to put Russia's 45,000 state-owned companies into the hands of the public. At the time, The total value of that sector was estimated to be approximately 1.4 trillion rubles. Tell us about the energy companies that were included in the privatization plan.
Obviously, the strongest part of the Russian economy were its energy businesses. And I think at the time when I got there, Russia was supplying 40% of all the natural gas into Western Europe. The oil companies were ginormous, had huge reserves. Any privatization process had to focus on oil companies, but they also privatized the electric utilities, the telecom companies, the fertilizer sector, the aluminum sector, which was the most competitive in the world because of Russia's cheap hydrocarbon industry. Virtually every consumer business in Russia was privatized. The reason they did this, Jim, is because none of these companies were profitable and they didn't have any working capital, and they needed to create a market where these companies could access capital. So the voucher privatization program, which was done successfully already in the Czech Republic and Hungary and Poland, was a program that the EBRD and IMF came up with, was taken to Russia. And so the idea was to create a small market. The Russian government kept most of the stock in the major oil companies until after 1999, when a lot of it was distributed through the loans for share scheme. But initially it was meant to just create this voucher auction was meant to create liquidity and create a stock market, which had been done a few years earlier in other Eastern European countries. The process was really chaotic. There weren't a lot of information on these businesses. The auctions themselves were not always publicized, open up to the full financial community. With the voucher auction, there was an incentive to not only buy good companies, but to go into the auctions where you knew most investors wouldn't participate, because the fewer vouchers that you used in an auction, the lower the price of the valuation of the stock would be. So many of the profitable energy companies were auctioned off without notice and done in a relatively secret way. And as a consequence, one of our first investments was in a company called Lukoil. We had heard about Lukoil through one of our investors, the former ambassador Bob Strauss, former U.S. ambassador to Russia, Bob Strauss. He was at Akin Gump, the law firm, and they were working with Lukoil, and we knew Lukoil was a company that had international aspirations. It was a company that produced 2 million barrels of oil a day, and we thought it would be a very high-quality company to be involved with. So that was one of our initial targets. And when we bought into Lukoil, it had a market valuation in early 1994 of about $350 to $400 million. Mm-hmm. Today, or just before it stopped trading when Russia invaded Ukraine, I think Lukoil had a market capitalization of over $60 billion. The valuations were literally rock bottom. I think we probably paid 1% to 2% of what Lukoil should have been valued at if they were traded on a Western exchange.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's launch into the Siberia Job. The story opens in a London bar where a young American banker, John Mills, is having a farewell nightcap before boarding a flight home to Dallas-Fort Worth the next day. As luck would have it, he meets a young Czech, Peter Kovacs, and his life changes forever. So take it away, John. Tell us the story.
First of all, I should point out that this is a slightly fictionalized version of the true story. And I did that for a couple of reasons. One, this all happened 30 years ago, and I literally could not put together the actual facts in a way that I could represent and write a book that was nonfiction. And secondly, the story itself is a financial story, and often financial stories, when you lay them out in all their bare factual reality, aren't all that interesting. So the meeting that I had in a bar with Peter Kovac, or the real character Peter Kellner, actually didn't happen. So I was introduced to Peter Kellner. He was in the Czech Republic. I was introduced by a former colleague from Merrill Lynch who I worked with in London. I told this former colleague that I was working on Russia, and he said, "You got to meet this guy, Peter Kellner. He wants to set up in Russia. He was hugely successful in the Czech voucher auctions, and he's an honorable guy and a trustworthy guy." And that was what I was looking for to go into Russia.
Well, and of course, the Russians adopted the Czech voucher model. So with Peter, with all of his experience, that would have been that obviously would have been a huge advantage for you. Peter spoke Russian. He had done some work in Russia. Tell us about your first trip to Moscow with Peter.
My trips consisted of flying from DFW to Frankfurt, 2 hours in Frankfurt, and then I'd get to the Czech Republic and spend a couple of days there, meeting and with Peter and his team, and kind of plotting our approach to Moscow. I had another good friend, Bernie Sucher, who was an ex-Goldman guy who had opened a bank in Moscow. He also owned one of the great nightclub restaurants there that we all went to. And so what we'd do is we'd wire money to Troika Dialogue Bank about 4 or 5 days before we went to Russia. And then when that money got there, they would turn it into $100 bills, and we'd basically take that money and go out onto the street. They traded all of these vouchers on a street corner. I can't remember the name of the street corner, but all the 140 million vouchers that were issued to every man, woman, and child. A lot of those vouchers were pretty quickly sold. These people didn't really know what to do with them, and didn't really understand how to participate in the voucher system. So they were sold, and there were local markets in the regions, and then those vouchers would come to Moscow, and they'd go to this area, this neighborhood in Moscow. And basically on the outer rings, you could buy and sell a few vouchers, and as you got closer to the middle, you could buy large amounts of vouchers. So typically early on, what we were doing is buying and accumulating vouchers, and then we were spending all of our time meeting with people and getting information about which companies we wanted to invest in, and trying to just get information. Information was the most valuable thing during those voucher auctions. And Peter had a team of people in place, literally hundreds of people who were gathering information and often buying vouchers and sometimes buying stock at the factory gate. Some workers at these companies were given stock. So all of it was aimed at kind of gathering information and preparing to submit vouchers into the auctions that we thought would be the most lucrative.
It sounds a little bit like the Wild West. You have certain designated street corners in Moscow where members of the public turn up with their vouchers in hand, and the vouchers exchanged for typically how much did you pay for a voucher? How much was what was the going rate to buy a voucher?
Well, remember that all of these auctions took place in 1 year. They all took place in 1994. And I think the final voucher auction was in late September, early October. So the vouchers essentially became worthless once the voucher process was over. So when we started buying vouchers, we were buying them for $6 or $7 a voucher. And when we finished buying in probably late August or September, I think they'd gotten up to about $22 a voucher. So on average, call it, if they were traded for $10 and there were $140 million, there were roughly $140 billion worth of vouchers that were submitted.
Mm-hmm. And so after the first phase of the operation, which was to actually go out there and buy the vouchers, what was the dollar value of the vouchers that you accumulated?
So I think we put between $15 and $20 million in total into the voucher auctions. Mm-hmm. And it's some of the companies we were able to buy stock because, as I mentioned earlier, the management of some of these companies were given stock in the voucher privatization process. So we probably spent part of that money buying stock directly from executives at Lukoil or one of the other oil companies, but probably about close to $15 or $18 million were submitted into the voucher auction.
Now, one of the companies that you bought through the voucher system was a tobacco company called Kursk Tobacco. And of course, they were responsible for producing domestic brand cigarettes in Russia, but also they produced counterfeit American brands like Marlboro, Camel, Parliament, Lucky Strike, Newport, all the rest. And tell us about those steps when you actually got enough vouchers so that you had a meeting with the lawyer for Kursk Tobacco in his office. That says a lot about the way business was being done in Russia at that point. Tell us a little bit about that story, John.
That's actually the shortest chapter of the book, and it's a quick read. I'm happy to read it. Would make sense.
Please go ahead, John.
So just to set this up, these are exciting times. We're submitting vouchers. We're beginning to get the results of the voucher auctions. We found out that we had gotten a much larger stake in Kursk Tobacco than we thought we had. I think we submitted $300,000 or $400,000 worth of vouchers in this, and we're going to the company. We'd found out how much we'd gotten from the registrar. We're on the registrar's list as the owners, and we wanted to introduce ourselves and get us entered into the shareholders list that was held by the company. So this is Chapter 8 in the Siberia Job. The boardroom of Kursk Tobacco looked like every other nice office John had seen so far in Russia. Wood veneer and Soviet deco wall clock. It was a nice office building not far from the Kremlin. John and Peter were sitting on one side of a long table. On the other side was a solemn-looking, slightly overweight Russian man. "Gentlemen," he said in English, "I understand you wish to exert some control over the operations of the company." "Yes," said Peter. "That is, of course, your right as majority shareholders, or at least it will be your right as majority shareholders once you sign our investiture documents. But the minority shareholders wish to make something clear before you do." "Who are the minority shareholders?" said Peter. "They wish to remain anonymous," said the man. "But you may think of them as bratya." "Bratya," said John. "Literally, it means brothers," said Peter, who was looking uncomfortable. "What does it mean, not literally?" said John. "Mafia," said Peter. John nodded, and for a moment, no one said anything. "Are they trying to keep us from registering our shares in the company?" said John finally. "No," said the man. "In fact, they can see advantages to your being a majority shareholder of Kursk. But they wish first for you to understand the responsibilities that will go along with your ownership." "Which are," said John after a pause. "Kursk has an unusual business model. You will be liable for it. Not that there is any cause for concern." "What's the business model?" said Peter. "It's generally understood that Kursk manufactures and distributes cigarettes."
Mm-hmm.
He paused, and after a moment, Peter said, "Okay, but it does not only manufacture Kursk cigarettes." "I don't follow," said John. "Kursk also manufactures Marlboros, Camels, Lucky Strikes, Parliaments, Pall Malls, Newport, Winstons. Kursk manufactures maybe 1 in 3 Western cigarettes sold in Eastern Russia and Central Asia." "You make counterfeit cigarettes," said John. "And now you do too," said the Kursk man. "Jesus," said John. "Are you saying that's how you generate your revenue, fake name brand cigarettes?" "No," said the Kursk man, "not at all. Kursk is legitimately a very profitable company, and illegitimately a much, much more profitable business. But here's the issue. Your new partners do not intend to modify this business plan. With Westerners or Czechs nominally running the company, your partners believe it would help to expand these operations to new markets. Mutually beneficial, everyone earns, you see. But as I said, you will be liable to the Russian courts. If you do not wish to participate in this business model, your partners will buy you out. The choice is yours." John and Peter looked at each other. Each saw the other was at a loss. Peter turned back to the Kursk man. "Buy us out? How much?" The Kursk man produced a billfold from which he removed a bank check. He slid it across the table. Peter picked it up. $1,000. "Yes," said the Kursk man. "As I say, your new partners feel either choice will be satisfactory to them, but assuming you do not wish to remain partners, they do not wish to overpay." "Uh-huh," said John. "And if we were to offer to sell to a third party?" "As the lawyer for Kursk, I can tell you that we handle these matters of stock strictly in accordance with Russian law. Your stock is not publicly negotiable, so if you were to attempt to sell it to a third party, it would simply remand to the company." "Uh-huh," said John. "So what shall I say to the gentleman?" said the Kursk man, holding up his hands. "Welcome or farewell?" John and Peter looked at each other. Then John turned back to the Kursk man. Obviously, we're going to need some time to discuss this. Of course, said the Kursk man. Take 24 hours.
I wanted you to read that, John, because it really gives the listeners a sense of some of the downsides of this voucher system and, of course, the way business was done in Russia at that time. Who knows how it's done now? But let's move on to some of the other elements of the story. You mentioned earlier that many of these auctions were taking place in the hinterland of Russia. Let's remember that Russia is the largest country in the world with 6.6 million square miles of territory, which is double that of the United States. There are 11 different time zones, and in particular for the oil and the natural gas companies, those reserves, of course, are found in Siberia, in this vast landmass of Russia. So you and Peter then had to travel to some of these far-flung Siberian cities, Irkutsk, Omsk, among others, where the auctions were going to be held. Now, when those auctions were held in those cities, because they're far, far from the major population centers of Moscow, St. Petersburg, very few people turned up at those auctions. Give us a sense of how it was to have to travel those great distances. I remember there's one great anecdote in the book where you talk about chartering a Tupolev 4 old bomber. It was modeled on the B-29 in order to get around in the Soviet Far East. Give us a sense of how those auctions that you attended out there in Siberia and how successful you were, because there were fewer participants out in the Soviet Far East.
So, Jim, to unpack that a little bit, you're right. A lot of these auctions were not done in a way where people could access them, and that was to give company insiders a chance to control more of the stock with fewer voucher auctions. And most of the auctions were done in Moscow and were relatively standard. The one exception to that was for Gazprom. Gazprom is the largest and most profitable company in Russia. It's the monopolistic producer of natural gas and the supplier to Western Europe. And the story, the Siberia Job story, is really about how we were able to access that particular auction. The auction process was administered by a guy named Anatoly Chubais, and this Chubais was really one of the good guys. He was a real Boy Scout. He really wanted to do this vast Russian privatization as quickly as he could to make it impossible for the communists to not come back to power. And you have to remember, Boris Yeltsin was running things, but there was a communist politician, I think his name was Zyuganov, who was only 5 or 10 points behind Boris Yeltsin in terms of popularity. And there was a big election in 1996 that puts Yeltsin back in power. And so the idea was to get all this stuff privatized and create a market before the communists could come back to power. Gazprom did not want to participate in the auction. They finally agreed after Yeltsin and Chubais changed the rules a bit so that they could undertake the auction on terms that were favorable to them. And so Gazprom auctioned off its stock in I think 28 different regions in Russia, and auctioned it off in sizes that were relative to the amount of operations they had in those regions. Mm-hmm. And you can imagine in 1994, when literally hundreds of auctions are taking place every month, and no information is being, given out in a standard format, nobody could really tell where remember, this is the most valuable asset in Russia and the one that everybody wanted to participate in. Mm-hmm. And nobody could really tell where the stock was going to be auctioned and in what regions and in what size. And we were able, with the help of my partner, Peter, to get a contact on the board of directors of Gazprom who fed us the information that we needed to participate in these auctions, in these regional auctions. So the most remote region we traveled to was in the Yamal prefecture inside the North Pole, where Gazprom's vast reserves of gas and their LNG facilities are located. And really what we did, we traveled there with teams of people, and we would be submitting vouchers. We had numbers of people that were submitting out vouchers, and we actually found local people, because the rules said that the local people had to submit vouchers. Uh-huh. We were sending teams up there undertake these operations, And we were generally showing up 2 or 3 days before the Gazprom management people were showing up to submit their vouchers. And as they found out that we were doing this, they were getting increasingly upset with us. The book takes a little bit of fictional license in that not all the places the book outlines were the actual places where we submitted the vouchers, but we did travel outside of Moscow to do that. I don't remember a lot of train trips, but the train scenes are dramatic content and help the reader understand the sense of excitement and danger at the time. But we put a lot of miles on the books getting to these regional auctions, and we were much more successful than we thought we'd be. We probably got 7 to 8 times as much stock as we thought. And when the management of Gazprom found out how much stock we'd gotten, they were very perturbed and upset. And they asked the same KGB guy that was on the board, who was our contact, was then charged with trying to get all of our stock back from us. What ensued was a series of very tough negotiations. We wanted to keep the stock we had gotten. They wanted to get it back from us. So it was a very difficult period.
Well, understandably. I mean, Gazprom is a monopoly, is it not? Russia has, 24% of the global reserves for natural gas? And you folks ended up owning a pretty sizable stake in the company, and the 24% of global reserves in natural gas.
I think Gazprom was 7 times the size of Exxon and Shell in terms of their hydrocarbon reserves at the time we were participating in their auction. Yeah, there was an incentive for them to get their stock back.
How did that negotiation go with the KGB fellow who was charged with getting those shares back from you? How did that unfold?
Their opening bargaining position was very simple. We're going to kill you. I think I was safely back in Texas when they made that initial proposal.
John, of course, you and I both know, of course, in American corporate parlance, we talk about a win-win negotiation. That's hardly a win-win negotiation, but please proceed.
We realized they weren't going to kill us. I mean, relatively few Americans have ever been killed in Russia, and there was no way they were going to kill us. It would have been terrible. They may have wanted to kill us, but it would have been terrible PR, and we knew it. And we said, look, you have legitimate U.S. investors in this deal. I think we had 65 or 70 investors in the deal, and including former Ambassador Bob Strauss,
yes,
who Yeltsin, really liked a lot. I mean, remember Bob got on the back of the tank with Boris Yeltsin when the military was trying to overthrow him at one point, and it looked to Russia like America was standing behind Boris Yeltsin, and it kept him in office. So we had a number of very senior Wall Street executives invested in this deal, and we made it very clear to them that violence was not an option. Mm-hmm. And then their next proposal was, fine, just sign these documents, give us all the stock back. We said, no, we're not going to do that. Then we were sort of at loggerheads, but eventually we were able to work out a deal with them where they took a percentage of our stock, and they gave us in return, because foreign investors technically weren't allowed to own Russian domestic stock, so it would have been difficult for us to go on to the registrar of shareholders as foreigners. We gave up a large percentage of our stock, and in return we got GDRs, global depository receipts, that we could trade in London. Ultimately, we reached a win-win deal by surrendering a large percentage of our stock. They gave us something that had good value that we could trade, and ultimately Merrill Lynch did a big underwritten offering and sold our stock. Pretty substantial gain for us.
So can you share with us what was your total investment in Gazprom, and what was the value of the buyout when Gazprom bought the shares back from you?
We probably put a total, so we had money in our fund invested in Gazprom, and then we raised a special purpose vehicle to invest. And then there were a number of other investors in the deal, including Michael Steinhardt, I think, had a position, and a number of private individuals. But we probably put close to $20 million into the deal. Mm-hmm. We sold some in a private placement, a large asset manager based in Los Angeles called the Capital Group. And then we did a public offering with Merrill Lynch and sold shares I think I recall about $7 a share. So our cost basis for all of our funds was roughly 25 cents a share, or 28 cents a share, something like that. And we got out for close to $7. The stock ultimately went to 40, so we would have much better served by holding on to it. Good deal.
From 25 cents a share to $7 a share, that's quite a killing. No pun intended.
Good one.
So Gazprom was really the crowning glory, if you will, of your voucher privatization plan in Russia. Were there any other examples that you'd like to share with our listeners today? Of course, Kursk, the tobacco company, that didn't work out quite so well as Gazprom.
That was a zero.
That was a zero, right.
Complete write-off.
Any other investments you'd like to share with us?
So there were, I think we probably participated in 15 different auctions of varying degrees. I mean, I think Lukoil was probably our most successful investment in Russia. And really, when you're looking at, the 2,500 companies that were being privatized, everything was deep value. Everything was trading at 1 to 2% of intrinsic value, or where it would have traded if it were on a Western exchange. So when everything is cheap, you're looking for investments that are high quality, that have great assets, that are great business models, and great management that wants to go in the right direction. And that was Lukoil. They had a fantastic executive team, a guy named Vagit Alexbirov, who had been the Minister of Energy before he went to go run Lukoil, and then another guy named Leonid Fedun, who was a former KGB guy, but very influential, very well plugged in. And their goal, quite simply, was to become like Exxon. And they had a business model in their head, and they had Western advisors, investment banks, and lawyers who were telling them what they needed to do. And when you buy something that's trading at 1 to 2% of intrinsic value, Lukoil never traded as well as Exxon, and never traded at that valuation per barrel or of reserve or as a multiple of cash flow. But ultimately it probably got to 40 or 50% of that valuation at one stage. And a lot of people think, I'm not going to buy those Russian stocks because they're never going to be as good as Western European or U.S. companies, and that's a fair proposition. But the reality is you just have to close the gap a little bit to make a lot of money, and that's what happened with a company like Lukoil. Lukoil has a very strong multinational presence, and that's how it got to a $60 billion market cap, and it's still well short of Exxon's $400 billion market cap, but it made a lot of progress, and investors in Lukoil made a lot of money.
And John, after the voucher privatization program was over, did you continue to be an investor in Russia, or was that the end of your Russia investing days?
It's a little bit complicated. What happened is my partner and I were running a smallish emerging market fund, $60 to $70 million, and we put 15 to 20 of it into Russia in the voucher auctions. And then from, call it February of 94 to September, October of 94, the value of those holdings went up 8 to 10 times. So all of a sudden, our little emerging market fund is actually a pretty good sized fund that's 80% invested in Russia, which, was not, from a portfolio management standpoint, was not good risk diversification. So rather than just selling out our positions, we spun them out into what we call the Russia Value Fund. And at the time, people were clamoring to get exposure to Russia, and they were unclear about custody. They were unclear which were the right companies to own. We had a tailor-made portfolio of companies all ready to go. So we spun that out and created this Russia Value Fund, and created a really one of the first large investable hedge funds in Russia in 1994, and that was very successful, and it was so successful that I was the junior partner. I was a 25% partner. My senior partner thought that he should be running this bigger part of our business now, and as often happens in partnerships, we had a dispute, and the guy with the most equity won, and so he forced me out, and I started my own fund in 1996 that was a macroeconomics fund that had a broad global mandate. So I was out of Russia pretty much by 1997, and I was fortunate because in 1998 the Russian market collapsed, and virtually every major Russia fund was put out of business or was down 90% or so in 98. I actually sidestepped that disaster and was quite fortunate to be able to put money to work in Russia in 1999, and after the market was down 90%. So I had a second bite of the apple in 1999 and made quite a bit of money for the next 4 or 5 years. People forget that Vladimir Putin, who took over for Boris Yeltsin in 99, he was actually a real Boy Scout when he first got there. He had a market reform mentality. He was very, very close to the West. He was the first global leader who was at the site of the 9/11 disaster at the World Trade Center with George Bush. He wanted a close relationship with the West and with the United States, and did all the right things and did all the right market reforms that made the stock market go up. I mean, I think the first 5 or 6 years Putin was in office, the stock market went up 20x. Something went wrong in 2003 and 2004 with Putin. People debate what it was, whether it was NATO enlargement or the oil prices going up and Russia becoming relatively financially independent. I think it's probably more likely what happened is the KGB, the whole security apparatus of Russia, I think started to permeate the business and the markets, and Russia and Putin just got increasingly hostile to the West, and it became clear to me that the Russians just weren't going to tolerate foreigners having a big place in their markets, and Russian companies stopped caring about foreign investors and stopped doing the right things from a corporate governance standpoint, and Russia, became somewhat uninvestable by 2006, 2007, and I've really been out ever since.
And John, what happened to your Czech partner, Peter?
As we were talking earlier before the call, the characters of the book are compositions. So the character of Peter is actually two Peters. The one Peter that everybody is familiar with, Peter Kellner, was tragically killed in a helicopter ski accident in Alaska a little over 2 years ago. And he was an unbelievable businessman. He took the proceeds from this Gazprom deal and used them to recapitalize his businesses that he had acquired in the Czech Republic. And he had an industrial and financial holding company in Eastern Europe that was really large. And he went on to develop businesses in Russia as well. And I think at the time of his death, he was the wealthiest man in Eastern Europe. I think he was worth well over $10 billion. I know. Subsequent to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think a lot of his businesses have fared poorly. He was an incredible business success before his death.
Well, John, in the remaining few minutes of the podcast, what are your closing thoughts about the Siberia Job?
It's a great, fun book to read. We're getting unbelievable comments and reviews from people. It's historical fiction, but it's historical fiction based on a true story, and I think it's a readable book. It gave me a great opportunity to reconnect with dozens of my former friends and colleagues who did business with me, and it was a wonderful opportunity to work with a bright young writer, Josh Galertner, who is Josh Haven. On the cover of the book, Josh was really a creative genius and was able to listen to all these stories that we were telling him and all the research we were doing and wove it into an incredibly readable story that is pretty much true, surprisingly. Most of the things in the book are true. They're just put together in a way that helps the reader get through it quickly. So those are my comments, and I really enjoyed speaking with you today, Jim. Thank you for having me.
Well, John, thank you so much, and I second your opinion. It was a very readable book. I read it in about 4 or 5 hours. It really brought back a lot of the memories of that early 1990s period and the privatizations of Eastern Europe and in particular in Russia. But once again, John, thank you for joining us. We look forward to having you back on a future occasion.
Great.
And for our listeners, today's episode is number 414 as we continue to mark the 3rd anniversary of the San Francisco Experience podcast. We're featured on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Amazon Music, 19 platforms in total, with a listener audience spanning 65 countries. And make sure to subscribe. This has been the San Francisco Experience with Jim Herlihy, coming to you from San Francisco.